I have never, in all my time playing video games, found one that meant as much to me as Undertale does. I know this may be a silly thing for me to say when the game has been out for 5 years today, and the law of the internet seems to suggest that the game is long past the point worth talking about, but it's completely true. Through my journey with this game, playing it, enjoying it, crying over it, appreciating it, defending it, meeting people through it, I realized that having found it has truly changed my life, which is not the type of praise I dole out lightly. Yet in all the time that I've been a fan of this game, from the first day I heard of its existence from a friend on the school bus to the present day, I've never really taken the time to dissect it, or fully understand how this game got its hooks in me. I could simply leave it at, the game just appeals to me, but that's a very subjective conclusion and fails to make a meaningful assessment of Undertale's quality. So in this video, I seek to take a more objective approach and suss out how all of its pieces coalesce together into a whole that is more than the sum of its parts. However, in order to do that, I will also have to look at the game with a more critical eye, and that may very well mean acknowledging its flaws as well as its strengths. But I'm afraid to do that. To find things I don't like about something that means so much to me almost makes me think that it won't be so special to me anymore. After all, I could just throw it to the wayside like most people have already done, and nothing about my life would really change. But that's not how I appreciate my media. When something is that special to me, I want to just treasure it for as long as I'm physically able. Nonetheless, I'll carry on anyway, because to acknowledge Undertale's shortcomings and adore it regardless is a more mature way to appreciate it than to simply herald it as perfect. So yes, even though this video's title is Why Undertale Means So Much to Me, most of this video will just be a review of the game, because the full picture of this game is necessary to fully grasp my admiration for it. On that note, there will be spoilers for nearly everything in this game, so I cannot recommend enough that you play it for yourself before continuing, if you haven't already. I have a lot to gush about, so let's just get right into it. These are all the reasons that Undertale means so much to me. Beginning with the gameplay, the most important part for any video game to get right, Undertale appears to be a very typical JRPG where you roam around a large overworld, occasionally get pulled into random battles, collect money and or experience points depending on the route you take, find or buy new weapons and armor, and experience a grandiose story. Technically speaking, Undertale's gameplay loop is not exactly anything new, however each and every facet of it is tweaked in small ways to set them apart from not only the rest of the crowd but their direct inspirations. The easiest way I can illustrate this is to go over the battle system. Upon first impressions, the visual design is extremely similar to old 8 and 16-bit RPGs, especially the later Dragon Quest games and Shin Megami Tensei. At the bottom of the screen are a list of options. The fight option, of course, hits the enemy with a physical attack, however it's not simply a one-and-done deal. Instead, a gauge fills the screen with a bar sliding across. How much damage you do depends on how close to the center of the gauge the bar is when you press the action button again. Now, this is also something that has been done in other RPGs, and the most famous use of it is in the Mario RPGs. However, what makes this game's implementation of this mechanic even more interesting is that different equipable weapons make alterations to the number of bars on the gauge and the timing at which they appear. For example, the toy knife will give you 1 bar only, but the frying pan, for example, will give you 4 hits, and hitting the last one deals extra damage. It's not much in the grand scheme of things, but it's a nice way to spice up what would, in other RPGs, become a very stale gameplay loop. However, it's not the offensive side of combat that makes Undertale's battle system so special, but rather the defensive side. In most other RPGs, you're more or less forced to take an attack from an enemy, as your character cannot move in battle. Again, the Mario RPGs mitigate this trope by allowing you to dodge with well-timed button presses, but Undertale goes a step further and places you in a bullet hell style arena, wherein you dodge enemy projectiles by moving around a square area. This sounds like it might drag the battles out, but nearly every enemy has at least one unique attack pattern, which keeps random battles from growing stale too quickly. What's so brilliant about these parts is that they're entirely reliant on your skill as a player. While it is a tried and true formula, I don't find it particularly satisfying in normal RPGs to have your stats be the only thing affecting your performance in battle. You can make the argument that strategy is what makes those games not boring, but the strategy that normal JRPGs require is so minimal as to be almost meaningless. Action RPGs are a little better in that regard because they require you to be active and strategize on the fly, so even if you grind some levels, you can still screw up the battle if you play recklessly. But there are many times where even if you play perfectly, you simply won't be strong enough to last to the end of certain battles. Meanwhile, how you do in Undertale comes almost entirely down to your actions as a player, And even if you initially suck at these parts, keep at it and you'll notice considerable improvement. This, to me, is far more satisfying than fighting tons of the same random mooks over and over again until the game gives you better numbers to fight more random mooks with. Something else fantastic about the defense portion is that so much is done with it over the course of the game via the use of new bullet types and methods of movement. For example, green projectiles will give you back 1 HP for touching them, blue projectiles will pass through you only if you remain still, orange projectiles will pass through you only if you're moving, and of course in the late game, enemies and bosses alike will combine several of these bullet types together to test your reflexes and quick decision making. As a further step up from that, certain bosses will completely change the way you play the game. For Papyrus' boss battle, he applies gravity to the bullet hell arena, turning the dodging minigames into platforming challenges. Undyne's boss battle involves you swinging around a spear which she gives you to block incoming projectiles from 4 directions, like DDR. Mettaton EX has you shoot projectiles out of the way either to remove them from the playfield or alter their behavior. The number of ways in which this simple mechanic is fleshed out seriously puts other RPGs with several times its length to shame. Though, to be fair, in your average Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest game, more time is likely to be spent on item customization to give your party certain buffs in battle, whereas the battles themselves are relatively simple. To be honest though, I could never get into pre-battle strategizing in those games. Most of the time it just felt restrictive, and while some RPGs have item combination systems or more side grade type armor classes rather than upgrades, rarely do I ever feel like using them actually matters. In Undertale, every movement you make in battle matters, not simply the decisions you make outside of battle, and to me, that's far more engaging gameplay-wise. Of course, Undertale's main gimmick is the fact that you don't have to kill any of the enemies. That's what the act option is for. It brings up a list of actions you can take against each enemy, like check, praise, flirt, flex, insult, etc. The main appeal of the act menu is the flavor text that appears when you use an action on an enemy, as well as each enemy's unique response. This part of the game is more akin to puzzle solving than actual combat, as you need to figure out what the quickest way to dissuade the enemy from fighting you is. Sometimes you can figure it out by checking the enemy and reading its description, and sometimes listening to its dialogue. Though, in essence, acting is basically the same as just choosing from a list of spells in another RPG, except they cost no magic points, since those don't exist in this game, and they don't drain the enemy's health, but they do make the battle go by a little faster. Items function exactly the way they do in other RPGs. You can use them both in and out of combat for healing effects, or you can equip new weapons and armor, which is most commonly found lying around on the floor, but can also be bought in shops. It's worth mentioning that there is no equipment management screen. You can only ever hold one weapon and one piece of armor, so item customization isn't necessary. However, certain weapons and armor pieces do have special properties, such as increasing your attack, giving you more invulnerability time after a hit, or healing you a bit after each turn. However, they're not all made equal, and you certainly won't be racking your brain over which piece of armor is the better one to have. Really, whatever weapons or armor pieces you got most recently are the best. You could also save up for the Temi armor, which more or less breaks the game, but it's prohibitively expensive. However, its price drops with every time you die, so you're only going to need it if you really suck at this game, like me. To be fair though, I won't knock anyone who finds the Temi armor necessary, because this game can actually get pretty difficult towards the end of the neutral and pacifist routes, and downright brutal in the genocide route. However, the challenge, I would argue, never gets to a point where it seems unfair. I'll go more in depth about this when talking about the individual fights, but suffice to say, I think Undertale's difficulty curve is just about perfect. It's easy enough for just about anyone at the beginning, but a suitable test of all your skills and knowledge of the game mechanics by the end. Getting back to the topic of the battle menu, there's only one more option, Mercy. Inside this option are 2 choices. You may spare an enemy once its criteria for doing so has been fulfilled. Often this means solving the puzzle that pertains to that specific enemy, but for some it can mean lowering their HP to the point that they get too scared to fight you any longer. As far as I can tell, this is still a valid way to do the pacifist route, if much riskier. The other option in the menu is to run from battle, and to my knowledge, this always succeeds, which is usually not the case in other RPGs. It's kind of a breath of fresh air, honestly, to have yet another integral game mechanic free from the clutches of a random number generator. However, you could make the argument that because the run command always succeeds, it removes most of the challenge from this game, because you can just run from every non-essential battle without fail, and yes, that's certainly true, but if you run from every encounter, you won't get any gold after each battle, which of course you will need to buy more healing items. Not even the boss battles give you any gold. Of course, if you're good enough at the game, you won't need no healing items, so you could look at this more of a challenge to players than a design flaw. Of course, most of your playtime will be spent traveling through the underground, solving various puzzles to progress, and truth be told, they're not particularly challenging. You never need to really flex your brain muscles to solve them, but they're not so easy that they might as well not be there. They serve as a decent way to make the act of walking from point to point a little more engaging, and it's honestly to their benefit that they're not super difficult, because that means they never bog down the pace of the journey. Plus, each puzzle has some element of diegesis to it that makes them feel much less like video game set pieces, and more like part of the actual world. The bridge flowers and waterfall are a great example, but also the block puzzles in Hotland are commonly theorized to be training tools for killing humans. They're certainly not among the best puzzles that video games have to offer, but for what they set out to achieve, they do the job very well. As for the enemies themselves and their respective mini-puzzles, the majority of normal battles feature rather rudimentary puzzle solving. Oftentimes, the method of sparing an enemy will be as simple as picking one option on it, and some other enemies require that you pick one option 3 times in a row to spare them, such as Icecap, Gifttrot, and Aaron. And to be honest, these are my least favorite types, basically requiring you to sit through all the same attack patterns multiple times before you can end the battle. A couple enemies, however, such as Vegetoid and Washua, have healing attacks that you must touch for them to be satisfied and allow you to spare them. Some enemies, however, complicate the process, especially when they show up in groups. For instance, Jerry acts solely as a support monster and makes the other monsters' attacks last a little longer. You can ditch Jerry, but he'll return after 2 or 3 turns, so you're encouraged to end the battle beforehand. It's also very common for multiple different monsters to combine their attacks together, making for a busier environment in the playfield and a greater challenge overall. Certain mini-boss battles take a slightly different approach, as they do not rely on simply picking the right answer in the act menu, but instead maneuvering around the enemy projectiles or otherwise manipulating them to either fulfill the sparing criteria or make the enemy give up. These battles aren't incredibly substantial, but they do a good job at breaking up the usual rhythm of the random battles and providing another new type of challenge. However, the boss battles, as I mentioned earlier, are where it's really at. Each of the bosses in the game has a wider variety of attacks than any other enemy, with trickier patterns to boot. However, most of the boss battles follow a simple pattern of having a set order of attacks before reaching the end of their scripted dialogue. So in essence, they're merely endurance rounds which you need to last to the end of. Of course, this structure of having a set order of attacks is not necessarily a bad thing, as your dodging skills are still put to the test with every turn. So these battles never become boring, even if you get stuck on any of them. I do sort of prefer the approach Shovel Knight took to boss battles, where each boss has a set list of attacks, but they never do them in any consistent order, thus keeping you on your toes a little more. But at the end of the day, I still think that Undertale's combat works excellently for what it's trying to do. It's still plenty of fun regardless of which route you take, and the game does such a good job of keeping its battle system fresh and exciting, developing itself in new ways with each new area and each new boss fight. Tying all of that up in a relatively short runtime, 10 to 15 hours depending on how many side quests you do, you have a game that not only remains fresh from start to finish, but never overstays its welcome. Yes, 10 to 15 hours may sound far too short to someone who plays these games on the regular, but in my experience, most of my time playing RPGs has been spent either attempting to grind levels, wandering around due to poor direction, or in menus sorting equipment, and I don't consider any of these activities to be particularly fun. Not to mention, I often just don't have time to spend 25 to 50 hours on each and every classic JRPG that floats into my radar. I know purists will argue that those activities are just part of the experience, but there are certainly a few games in the genre which manage to trim away that fat just fine, and for my money, Chrono Trigger, Sweet Home, and Undertale are the reigning kings of the genre for me, because they're short, sweet, to the point, and each have their own unique spins on the template of the genre. However, there is just one last thing I need to mention, and that is the random encounter rate. Many really old RPGs especially can sometimes initiate new random battles after just taking 1 or 2 steps from where you fought the last one, and after enough repetitions, this can become tiring. Of course, since those days, measures have been taken in modern RPGs to prevent that situation from happening, ranging from raising the minimum encounter rate to displaying enemies on the overworld instead. Undertale falls squarely into the former category. Encounters are just infrequent enough that you'll probably never get pulled into a random battle more than once per room, and this is a very good thing in my book. However, this concept is flipped on its head in the genocide route, where in order to continue down it, you must kill a certain number of monsters before advancing to the next area. However, the more monsters you kill, the lower the encounter rate drops, a great reflection of the population literally becoming more scarce as you kill them. But as a result, you could be wandering around for several minutes before you find the next monster to kill, and pretty soon, the high encounter rates you were once experiencing don't seem so bad anymore. If you're thinking to yourself, gee, that's terrible game design, why would it be like that? Well, it's not, and there's a good reason, but I'll have to come back to it much later. Suffice it to say though, I think Undertale does a fantastic job of freshening up old RPG game mechanics, while still respecting its inspirations. But if you're looking at these battle scenes and thinking they look rather crude, well, how about we discuss further? Now, I've heard a lot of different takes about the graphics of the game. Some people say they're charming in their simplicity, while others say it looks like a 5-year-old could have drawn them. While I personally fall into the former camp, I can see a little bit where people in the latter are coming from. Overall, however, I think the game's visuals are quite pleasant. Most of the areas are rendered with more simplicity than even early Super Nintendo games, with many areas having no texture in the flooring, for example, but instead just blocks of color, with some occasional wall decorations to spice things up. Some are definitely better than others, but what stands out more to me than the visual fidelity of the graphics themselves is the strong use of color, and the individuality of nearly every environment and character design. As evidenced by the official art book, Temmie Chang seems to have drafted a majority of the NPC designs, and she also handled a great deal of the concept art as well as touching up Toby Fox's sprite contributions. Her visual flair can be found throughout the game, and her use of color is great as always. Snowdin's juxtaposition of desaturated blues and greens against warm oranges and yellows gives such a distinct comfiness to the setting. Waterfall is mostly a dark shade of purple, but certain areas have pitch black grounds and walls, while the water, grass, and plant life is a bright neon blue, giving an almost ethereal quality to the area. New Home is probably my favorite area in spite of its simplicity. It more or less just uses the same tile set as the ruins in Toriel's house, but where those locations were once inviting and comforting, with bold yet warm colors. Now all of the color is gone, faded into middling shades of gray. Not only does it make the player reminisce about those early locations, but it also reflects Asgore's longing for the days when his family was by his side. Of course, those are just the highlights, but each location in the game is full of personality and visual flair. The character designs are nothing to sneeze at either. Every NPC and enemy monster has a unique design that, despite some of them being ridiculously simple or just plain ridiculous, they're not only distinct from one another in the walking segments, but even in battle where they're all simply black and white. This is admittedly a nitpick, but it always bothered me just a little how many RPGs fall into the trope of recoloring enemies and giving them different sets of stats. In the 8 and 16-bit era, this was understandable because memory limitations were much more severe, but even when those games get remade for new console generations, none of those recolors are given new artwork to go along with them. By having the battles be in black and white, UnderTale essentially forces all of its enemies to have unique designs, and even if some are similar to one another, they all have interesting visual differences that set them apart from their original incarnations. Of course, that's not even touching on the main cast, who all have such appealing designs that also perfectly fit their character. Toriel's rectangular torso and soft curves make her resemble a pillow. Papyrus's lanky but rounded structure gives the impression of a horribly lopsided but fascinating sculpture, and his bright red and white clothes contrast well with Sans' muted blacks and blues. Alphys and Undyne have a nice primary color scheme going on with each other, and even though Asriel in his God of Hyper Death form looks very similar to Toriel, the simple additions of a collar, shoulder pads, and longer, more outward-facing horns as opposed to Toriel's inward-facing horns gives off a more threatening vibe than hers does, and naturally this gets turned up to 17 when he enters his Angel of Death form, not only gaining some skull-like facial features, but the shape of his wings and body even closely resembles the Deltarune seen throughout the game, which Gerson alludes to when you visit his shop. Do I even need to mention the bizarre, uncanny, and downright terrifying appearance of Omega Flowey? The photorealistic assets combining disparate elements from plant life, human flesh, mechanical pipes, and occasional crude pixel art creates a truly nightmarish sight. Even during some of this fight's more outlandish attack phases, the sense of unease never truly goes away, and Everdread's work on the visuals in this part is absolutely fantastic. In fact, while I'm at it, I do have to give proper credit to GGDG, Marigo, Magnolia Porter, and Kenju for all the work they did as well. However, there are a few spots in the game where it seems as though the graphics are just straight up unfinished. The place this was most apparent was on the road to Asgore's house, where a bunch of buildings are placed on a black background, but instead of simply fading into the void, they just cut directly from the tile to the background, and it looks really amateur. There's also a couple of flaws with transparency overlap during certain battles, mainly Undyne's and Asriel's. There's also this one sprite for the Royal Guard's attack, and I'm not sure what it's supposed to be. For the longest time I'd assumed it was a carrot, but it's too short and round, so maybe it's a beet? I don't know. Of course, there are plenty of other crudely drawn assets in the game, such as the faces of Onion-san or some of the miscellaneous items during date scenes, but I would argue that they are meant to be crude because, well, it's kind of difficult to make something beautiful funny. And that's what I believe to be the greatest strength of this game's visuals: personality. What it lacks in overall quality, it makes up for by being so strong in its art style, giving life to each and everything that inhabits the screen, that I just can't fault it for that. Plus, even if you think this game looks absolutely hideous, you can't deny that the graphics are never so bad that they actually get in the way of gameplay. As an aspiring artist myself, I understand the struggle of trying to attain polish in your pieces very well, but even poor artists have the potential to make unique art that only they could make. To be honest, that's a quality I could only hope to attain with my own art, and that's something I absolutely see in Toby Fox and Tammy Chang. Of course, it helps that the latter is well known for her polish anyway. But with that out of the way, it's time to move along to... It's time to move along to the soundtrack! When it comes to the soundtrack of this game, I think this is the part of it that comes the closest to being unanimously good in the eyes of the world. Even friends of mine who said they don't like UnderTale are at least willing to muster praise for the music. Like most indie games these days, it features a hodgepodge of chiptune, sampled, and realistic instruments, which makes for a surprisingly appealing combination, especially in some of the final battle tracks. I have heard some people claim that the chiptune sounds very out of place alongside more realistic instruments, especially in the case of Hopes and Dreams, but I would heavily disagree. Since the game opens with just plain chiptune instrumentation, but then over the course of the game, more and more instruments enter the mix before they all coalesce at the emotional climax of the game. It feels like a proper build-up and not simply taking the lazy route of just throwing chiptune into songs because indie game. Some people have also criticized the game's use of samples from other video games. Many of this game's tracks feature samples from Earthbound, including the infamous Megalovania guitar, but among the other games represented are Mega Man X, Chrono Trigger, Mario Paint, Final Fantasy VI, and Cave Story. Using so many pre-existing samples from such classic video games, no less, would theoretically diminish the game's own musical identity, and in some circles people would consider this to be plagiarism. Yeah, ridiculous, I know. But do these samples detract from the game's musical identity? Maybe just a little, but certainly not enough to be distracting. I think Toby just liked the way that these instruments sounded in his compositions, and to be fair, I think the instrument choices are all very good. They evoke the sound of those early games exceptionally well without being bound by their limitations. I sort of look at Undertale's soundtrack as being very much a tribute to the games of generations past while still doing its own thing, very much like the game itself. And honestly, that's probably the highest praise I could possibly give it. Of course, a bigger part of the soundtrack's success is the way in which it uses leitmotifs to link moments to different emotional contexts. Despite having over 100 tracks, the soundtrack is only made up of a dozen or so different melodic ideas that get reused between tracks, and while to some people this may sound like a sign of laziness, leitmotifs can do a lot to tell a story just as complex as visuals or dialogue if you use them correctly. Each motif in the soundtrack is not only very memorable on its own, but they're all very well adapted to each situation in which they might play, simply through variations in the instrumentation, tempo, and slight alterations to the melody here and there. Of course, while the use of leitmotifs in Undertale's soundtrack is very satisfying, one may argue that their use does not exactly support the story very well. For example, Undyne and the Ruins share a leitmotif, but what do they have to do with one another? The date scenes and Snowdin share a leitmotif, but what do they have to do with one another? Muffet and Napstablook share a leitmotif, but they definitely don't have anything to do with one another. If Asgore and Toriel's battle themes share the motif used in Heartache, doesn't that make it the Dreamer's family motif? If so, why doesn't it appear in any phase of Asriel's fight? And yes, for as great as Megalovania is, it doesn't share any motivic traits with any other song in the game, since it was an old composition first appearing in the Earthbound Halloween hack and then in Homestuck, but it wasn't added to during development to give it any motivic ties to anything in Undertale. It doesn't even sound anything like Sans' theme, which is funny considering an unused boss theme for Sans is in the official soundtrack, though considering it also features Papyrus' leitmotif, it would probably fit better for a battle where you're fighting both of them. So yeah, the leitmotifs certainly aren't used in a groundbreaking way. In fact, you could argue that many of them are used incorrectly. But at the same time, considering Toby Fox had no proper training in composition, and that he was also handling so much of the rest of the game, I think it's perfectly forgivable. But even in spite of that, Undertale does an excellent job of supplanting the foundation of the story with the beautiful window dressing that is the soundtrack, especially in the latter half. All of the final battle themes, be they Asgore, a finale, Hopes and Dreams, or even Megalovania, are fantastic compositions from beginning to end, and area themes such as Another Medium and Core have just such an infectious beat. But my favorite is easily the game's title track, not just for the context in which it's played, but the whole song is just perfect. The instrumentation, the build up to the climax, that soft moment right before said climax, the composition, the use of a real guitar to set it apart from nearly every other song in the game which just used samples, it's perfect, and it never fails to leave me sobbing by the end. I know this is only Toby Fox's first proper soundtrack, but with this one alone, he'd already earned a spot high up on my list of favorite composers. It is just incredible from beginning to end, and even if discourse about this game's quality continues into the foreseeable future, I'm glad that we can at least agree this game's soundtrack is a bona fide treasure. But as mentioned earlier, the soundtrack is merely a supplement to the game's story, and the story and characters are what really put this game over the edge for me, so let's give them their dues. Now, on the surface, the narrative of the game is very simple. The main objective for you, the player, is to traverse through all of the underground of Mount Ebott, fending off all the monsters that inhabit it in order to go back to the surface. However, it becomes quickly apparent that things are not as black and white as they may seem. Unlike most RPGs where the monsters are just evil for the sake of being evil, or hold some sort of thin ideological high ground, like saying that humans are the cause of the world's problems and they should be wiped out, they demonstrate perfectly well they're capable of coexisting with humans, and they're mostly genuinely really good people, so it becomes hard not to sympathize with them. However, you also happen to drop in during a major turning point in their lives, as they've already collected 6 human souls and need 1 more to break the barrier trapping them underground. So to the monsters, you are the enemy smack in the middle of their territory. What also differentiates this game's story from most other RPGs is that it begins very small and personal, whereas a majority of other RPGs open with either exciting moments to get the player invested, or exposition dumps about the state of the world to show all the ways in which it's different from our own. And while Undertale's intro is something of an exposition dump, what it tells you is only a tiny fraction of everything there is to know about Undertale's world. Undertale instead takes its time, keeping the focus squarely on the player and their journey to get home, while gradually raising the stakes as the game progresses, with a couple bombshells sprinkled in the back half to heighten the emotions and tension, until eventually reality itself is put on the line. If that sounds like a huge jump in stakes for an RPG with a mere 10 to 15 hour runtime, that's because it is, but the game does an exceptional job of ramping up those stakes in a natural way, while still having the final revelations come as a major shock. The pacing of the game is quite remarkable too, and contributes a lot to the game's fun factor. While in most RPGs you will usually fall into a pattern of going from key point to key point, stopping to solve a problem in the area, then moving to the next one while occasionally coming into shops to restock your item supply, Undertale places far more emphasis on moving forward through each area. Yes, there are towns and shops, but because the game is designed to be beatable while you remain at level 1, you never need to grind to raise your levels, go back to a store for healing items or upgrades, or anything like that. As a result, there's never a point in the game where you're arbitrarily impeded from forward progress. Of course, there is still challenge in the random encounters and occasional mini-bosses, which can screw you up if you don't play carefully. You could argue that the plentiful dialogue slow the game down, but they're all still entertaining enough in their own right that I wouldn't consider that an issue. And of course, there are a fair deal of moments which are left in complete silence, just giving the player a moment to think and take in the atmosphere, a storytelling device commonly found in the films of Hayao Miyazaki. Though while these moments are certainly not handled with the same level of purpose, they are still very effective. There is something to be said about this game's particular blend of humor and drama, occasionally with the two occurring mere moments apart from one another, and to some, this may feel like severe tonal whiplash if you just look at all the scenes from a bird's eye view. While I understand where that mindset comes from, I would argue that Undertale handles these scenes with a remarkable delicacy, such that the humor and drama can flow very well into one another. And furthermore, when things get really serious, the game commits to it. It doesn't throw a joke into a scene where a character laments the death of another, nor are humorous moments too dramatically undercut by the direness of any given situation. However, what is most impressive to me is the wonderfully engaging way that this game goes about world building. A lot of the specifics about monster biology, monster culture, monster history, etc. are posted on placards and written in books strewn about the underground. Not only that, but nearly every notable object has flavor text that fleshes out whatever location you find them in, and in some cases they flesh out the characters as well. In fact, there's so much in this game to examine that I've developed a habit when going back to older RPGs to check whatever I think might give interesting descriptions, only to come up with nothing. Of course, the main reason you would want to search down every interactable object is because of the flavor text that is the most frequent source of this game's distinctive sense of humor. Speaking of the humor, something I really appreciate about it is that when you take a step back and look at the jokes themselves, they're surprisingly timeless. I feel like most people who attempt to write humor for a video game or movie or television show take the easy route of inserting pop culture references or current lingo or, God forbid, even dirty jokes, which in a lot of cases doesn't actually age very well. Just as a quick example, Homestuck was written in 2009, and early on one of the characters attains a laptop shaped like Bill Cosby, known as the Cosby Top. In concept, this is pretty funny, but considering Cosby's sexual assault allegations, it doesn't come off the way as intended anymore. Of course, Homestuck has a slew of less problematic pop culture references, and while they do date the comic by a great deal, the series leans heavily enough into it that it takes on a sort of time capsule-esque status, where we can all look back on it and appreciate it in a different but still valid way compared to the people who read it when it was new. UnderTale, by contrast, takes place in its own world, free from nearly all of the happenings of our own, but it is still set after the turn of the 21st century, so you would assume it would be filled with a lot of millennial humor. However, while the culture of the last decade did influence much of the game's writing, not just the humor, it takes the path of making subtle allusions to internet culture rather than blatant references or name drops, and I can appreciate that. It manages to balance its outflight influence and internal culture beautifully, so the game will likely continue to be just as relevant and funny many years from now as it was when it came out. Not only that, but many of the game's best jokes would probably feel right at home had this game come out a decade or two earlier. But don't let this game's lighthearted facade fool you. For a game that features eccentric skeletons making new spaghetti, fuzzy goat monsters getting their cell phones stolen by annoying dogs, and the Thames, this game can actually get very dark with its themes. Depression, anxiety, self-esteem, suicide, existentialism, nihilism, moral relativism, controlling relationships, coming to terms with loss, accepting one's own flaws and failures, and of course, murder for the sake of itself, are all covered to some degree by this game. Of course, it's not enough to simply say that a piece of media is good because it covers heavy subject matters. Especially when it comes to video games, it's all too common for these darker themes to be poorly developed to the point that they mean nothing, or for them to be used as shallow plot devices or shock tactics. UnderTale, however, has good reason to discuss these subject matters. Many of the plot's major turning points are influenced by how the characters handle each of these themes, and they're all treated with an appropriate level of maturity. But even with all the depressing subject matters, this game ultimately has a strong moral center, on multiple levels. On the narrative level, the moral is simply to be a decent person, to treat others with kindness, and even if they don't seem easy to get along with, work with them to understand and solve their problems. Even if you disagree with someone, as long as they're not causing others harm, be tolerant of them. Even if some people who only want to bring you down cannot be reasoned with, as long as you continue to be a good person at heart, and stay strong enough to continue not only improving yourself but improving others, your existence will have meaning. To some, that may seem like an overly simple message. After all, not every problem can be solved simply by being nice, and there are some problems that cannot be solved no matter what. But the worst thing you could do is give up on yourself. If you buckle under hardship and refuse to solve whatever problems you can, you'll never get anywhere, and when enough time passes, you'll lose faith in yourself. I can say from experience that especially over the past few years, seeing what has been happening in the world, it's been extremely difficult to stay determined, but as long as you do, you have the potential to do great things. However, on the meta-narrative level is a slightly different, less pressing message. Enjoy whatever you want, within reason. The game tells you at quite a few different moments that it probably isn't a good idea to obsess so much over this game. After all, everyone has a life outside of the game, with responsibilities, and even if life sucks, it probably won't be a good idea to throw it away to video games, or any one thing for that matter. Furthermore, if you obsess over something too strongly, you may very well end up hurting someone because of it. Flowey's whole character arc is about his refusal to let the game be won, because if it's won, then no one will be there to play with him. However, in doing so, he's causing great suffering to everyone he knew and at one point cared about. Yet even though Flowey is a very specific example, his failings are all too similar to those of real people, especially those in fandoms. It's an unfortunately popular trend among members of fandoms to try and police the people who don't adhere strictly to their vision of what the piece of media they're obsessed over is, and all they're doing is hurting people as a result. Sadly, this message was lost on a good majority of the UnderTale fandom itself, as many of its members continue to act in this manner towards others. Unfortunate to be sure, but enough people do properly understand this message that I still feel comfortable being a part of the fandom myself. This meta-moral is further compounded upon in the genocide route, which by design is only accessible if you really try to go down it. The genocide route is what happens when you get too wrapped up in seeing everything that this game has to offer, and should you go down this path, you will not be treated kindly. Everyone will refer to you as non-human, the humor is almost completely stripped away, towns will become rapidly unpopulated as the residents flee from you, the music becomes distorted and slowed down into a slow, drudging, disturbing mess, and as mentioned earlier, enemy encounters will become so infrequent that you may end up wandering around for several minutes before you get the chance to fight another monster, causing the game to become extremely boring. The game is trying to get you to stop playing it, and the only thing motivating you to continue is your desire to see what's waiting for you on the other side, despite all the lives being lost, some of them belonging to characters you may really care about. Should you persevere to the end, you'll find nothing waiting for you. There is no fulfillment to genocide for genocide's sake in the canon events of the world anyway. Your actions have consequences, and you're forced to face them, as the game becomes nothing but a black void of emptiness. The only way to be able to play the rest of the game again is to sell your soul. While this may allow you to play the rest of the game again, the pacifist endings are now ruined permanently. And to think, it could have been so easy for the game to screw this up by putting you in a situation where you had no choice but to kill a character and then have the game deride you for it. But here, you had every opportunity to stop before you hurt the last remaining person alive, but you didn't. The game will never allow you to run from your consequences, and they will follow you for the rest of your life. Unless, of course, you just delete the save file. Yes, knowing about this trick basically makes it so you can do all the genocide you want and still get perfect pacifist endings afterward, but if you do this, you're completely negating the way in which this game relates to our real world. You can't simply move outside your timeline and pick out any records of your misdeeds so that you can get away with whatever you want. And do not say that by doing this you're making up for having a bad play experience in the genocide route, because that's the whole point. You could also make the argument that the game doing this is pretentious or condescending or getting in the way of fun gameplay or complete bullcrap because you really want to get your money's worth out of it. And, well, if you think any of these things, it's unlikely I'm going to change your mind. Heck, some people get miffed at the monologue Sans gives you by the end of the neutral route because by simply subverting expectation, everyone immediately assumes that the game is pretentious, ignoring the fact that these elements are meant to support the message, which is actually very important, but so few people actually seem to interpret it properly and just, Basically, the genocide route and its story are probably the most divisive aspects of UnderTale because the game leans so hard into telling its story above preserving its gameplay that a lot of people who value gameplay most or even value gameplay alone are put off by it. It tries to prevent players from completing it when some of the game's best story moments happen near the very end. It is seemingly at odds with itself, but surprisingly, I still think it achieves what it sets out to do. Shadow of the Colossus had a very similar ethos with its plot and ending, and even though that game is heralded as a classic, some people couldn't buy into it, which is still completely valid. Taking a risk like this in creating a video game is something that few people have the balls to do, and it's nice to see cases like this arise every now and then, even if they don't succeed. Of course, I would argue that UnderTale does. However, for as excellent as the story is, there are some very small flaws in some of its storytelling techniques that can possibly ruin a player's experience. You see, earlier I mentioned the extra bits of storytelling that are tucked away in books in the library. Yes, I know I said that wrong on purpose. Placards on the walls of Waterfall's caves, and the journal entries and tapes in the True Lab, and they provide very nice diegetic storytelling without forcing you to sit through them. However, a lot of the information contained within them is vital to making sense of the pacifist ending, and the monologue that Flowey gives you in the genocide route doesn't fill in all of the blanks. A lot of very specific things about monster biology and culture, like a monster's essence being contained within an object that their dust was spread upon, or the degree to which monsters are weaker than humans, or even just where the flower that became Flowey came from, is only found in completely optional parts of the game. If you decided to skip these bits of information, you'd probably think that the pacifist ending makes no sense. Of course, the game rewarding you with entertaining flavor text for checking everything makes it so that you're unlikely to actually pass these things by, but if you don't think the game's writing is good, then you may very well want to pass them by. However, that's really the only problem I have with this game's story, honestly. It doesn't even have any plot holes, save for maybe a few that were insignificant enough that I could still suspend my disbelief for them. One possible plot hole that one of my friends brought up was the idea that the monsters could just dig a tunnel leading far away from the mountain if they were that upset about losing to the humans. But not only does Gerson straight up tell you that he and Asgore agreed it would be a bad idea to escape, since doing so would incentivize the humans to kill them, but monsters are weaker than humans by an astronomical margin. Even if this wasn't addressed and I was left to assume that this was their best course of action based solely on that power imbalance, in no way would that detract from the gravitas, thematic relevance, or engagement of the narrative. However, that narrative would be nothing without the characters, as their actions, backstories, and personalities are all intrinsically tied to it. Truly, more than any other quality, they are what makes UnderTale so special. Many of the monsters you meet along your journey will be hostile toward you, but through the process of pacifism you can simply win them over, and in the process they show you that they are all their own unique entities with their own personalities. Even if the randomly encountered monsters are rather one note, they are never carbon copied from another monster. The same could be said for most of the NPCs. Most of them aren't super interesting on their own, but they all have one-of-a-kind designs, ridiculous as some of them may be, and no monster is ever just like another one. Heck, a few NPCs even get little mini character arcs, which, even though they usually happen off-screen, are still very nice touches to liven up the cast of background characters. Of course, the main stars of the show are the primary supporting cast. Each and every single one of them are not only very entertaining, but also each get their own bits of character development sprinkled throughout the campaign. Each of them learns something new about themselves, and they all grow to be better people by the end, while still remaining just as entertaining the whole way through. If you'll permit me, I'd like to take this time to describe all of them in detail, because legitimately, they are all incredible characters and I could go on for hours about them. So here they are, in no particular order. Papyrus is defined mainly by his eccentricity and exaggerated demeanor, constantly flaunting his greatness and expressing his desire for attention on a large scale. When you first meet him, he eagerly proclaims his goal of capturing a human to bring to Undyne, the captain of the Royal Guard, so that he may join and gain the respect of all his peers. On the way to Snowdin, he attempts to use a series of puzzles to capture you, many of which backfire on account of Papyrus either not being the sharpest tool in the shed, or just severely overestimating their effectiveness. Like, he thinks a plate of spaghetti will be enough to stall you. On the subject of spaghetti though, cooking it is quickly revealed to be his side passion, as he mentions it in nearly every subsequent conversation you have with him. At the moment, this appears to be simply another one of his weird quirks that make him such a quirky character, but it's revealed in the date with Undyne that she taught him how to cook spaghetti because she didn't believe he had what it took to be in the Royal Guard. While Papyrus never properly realizes this fact for himself, he nonetheless realizes through fighting and then dating the player that being a Royal Guard is not really what he sought all this time, nor was it the admiration of a bunch of people he doesn't know the names of. All he wanted was a friend. Someone he could truly connect with on a personal level, and while connecting with Undyne was merely a means to an end for Papyrus, as a way of attaining his goal to join the Royal Guard, and Sans is often too facetious for his liking, the player opening up to Papyrus and letting him know he can still be great just by believing in himself, gives him the confidence he needs to be happy just being himself, rather than staking his self-worth in a cause for his own personal gain. Some people might argue he doesn't actually go through any sort of arc because by the end of the game he's still going on about how great he is, but what's important to understand is where that ego is coming from. When we first met Papyrus, it seemed as though it was coming from a place of insecurity, as though Papyrus was desperate for attention and wanted to prove that he was worth something to everyone. You could also argue that's the reason for his flamboyant nature, as his behavior would certainly be head-turning to a lot of people, but by the end his confidence is instead founded in itself. Now he just wants to be a good person for the simple satisfaction of doing so, not merely for reciprocation of attention. As for where his desire for attention came from, well, I can't say really, but that's fine, because Papyrus is still entertaining enough on his own that I don't really need to know why he wanted people's attention in the first place. And even then, it doesn't matter now that he's more or less achieved self-actualization. Undyne, on the other hand, basically seems to have everything she could want at her fingertips. She's the captain of the Royal Guard and has a large group of soldiers at her beck and call, and on top of that, she's insanely strong, like suplexes boulders for the hell of it strong. Upon our first encounter with her, she carries a menacing aura about her, saying very little in the interest of getting the job done as quickly as possible. But when you come face to face with her in battle, she quickly reveals that she revels in theatrics just as much, if not more so than Papyrus, except where his outward persona gave off an air of eccentricity, Undyne boasts heroism and proclaims how important she is to monster kind, all while making exaggerated battle cries whenever it's most dramatically appropriate. This continues on until you enter Hotland, when the arid temperatures cause her to collapse from exhaustion, at which point, should you choose to give her a cup of water, from a randomly placed water cooler no less, she'll retreat. Upon going back to her house to have a date with her, she reveals that she does indeed have a sentimental side, looking back fondly on her time training with Asgore and dropping subtle hints here and there that she has a crush on someone, while still attempting to come across as badass as possible toward you. She also reveals that much of her understanding of humans, as well as her bravado, comes from anime protagonists, whom she's convinced were in fact human historical figures. Furthermore, she reveals that she was always a hot-headed kid, looking to pick fights with just about anyone she could get her grubby little fists on, and through her recounting of her upbringing under Asgore's tutelage, it becomes apparent that her brazen attitude is simply a more focused version of the outward aggression that she'd supposedly had her whole life. Perhaps Asgore also inspired her to teach others, as even when she couldn't bring herself to let Papyrus into the Royal Guard on account of him simply being too nice to bring himself to hurt anyone, she instead started teaching him how to cook so that he could do something else with his life. But even this isn't the end of her character development, as the phone call conversations you have with her after the date show off a much more fun-loving side of her, wherein she consistently pokes fun at Papyrus, accidentally lets slip embarrassing factoids about herself, and in one of my favorite conversations, tackles Papyrus to the ground in a game of snow wrestling. I know she doesn't sound like it when I explain it this way, but Undyne is one of the most consistently hilarious characters in the whole game, next to Papyrus, and the two of them make perfect comedic foils for each other. While there are also a few places in which she reveals some history of her relationships with other characters like Alphys and Gerson, and her story about meeting Alphys remains a great showcase for how well she can build and maintain friendships with others, this is also evident in some neutral routes, wherein Undyne shows just how much Papyrus' death has really affected her, which leads into the last noteworthy thing about Undyne, her power level. Fighting Undyne in either the neutral or genocide route reveals that she has the ability to somewhat resist death, where all other monsters cannot. Furthermore, when she dies in the neutral route, she doesn't immediately dissolve into dust right away, but rather begins melting away. We wouldn't have learned this at this point, but it's believed that the power of determination, which is the canonical reason that the player comes back after each death, adversely affects the bodies of monsters and causes them to melt, because their physical forms cannot contain it. As for why Undyne doesn't melt until she's already close to death, I suspect her determination is minuscule and very much latent, such that only when she resists death through that power does it start to affect her body. However, in the genocide run, she manages to control that determination and change into a new form, far stronger than her previous one, Undyne the Undying. The battle with her that ensues is fittingly one of the toughest in the game, but ultimately ends in her demise, where she reveals that the time she's taken to fight you should have been just enough for Alphys to get the remaining monsters somewhere safe, and thus, she appears to get the last laugh. A fitting end for the Underground's greatest heroine. Next is Mettaton, who is first mentioned as a robot that Alphys created for the purposes of exterminating humans, but his grand entrance is decidedly not as intimidating as he was made out to be. Instead of simply being a murderous human-killing robot, he's also an incredibly famous TV personality who hosts what seems to be literally every TV show broadcast in the Underground. Game shows, cooking shows, operas, newscasts, dramas, he's got all of them under his belt. He's also apparently famous enough that several people look up to him as some sort of idol, and a few of them even describe him as attractive when really he's just a box with some arms, a wheel, and a voice. The antics that he gets up to with you are certainly very entertaining, and full of absurdist humor. However, even he has more sides to him than he may let on. As it turns out, not everyone thinks of him so fondly. Burger Pants, the sole employee of MTT Burger who works under Mettaton, yes, he even owns a burger joint, complains to the player regularly about Mettaton's stifling demands and nonsensical business decisions, such as his recipe for the Glam Burger, which is just a normal hamburger covered in sequins and glue. Yet because it's an MTT product, the residents of the Underground consume it like crazy. Furthermore, Burger Pants being the only employee of MTT Burger means that nearly all his free time is being eaten away by his job, completely stamping out his dream of becoming an actor. Burger Pants serves as an interesting contrast to Mettaton's supposed perfect public image, as he's likely the only monster around who is in any way aware of his true seedy underbelly, and being alone in that fact makes it all the more depressing because, to the public, he's the crazy one. Of course, Burger Pants being a funny character in his own right keeps this issue from getting too real, but it still makes you think. However, when you actually get to the battle with him, this, in my opinion, is where his character and humor falls apart a little bit. During the battle, you flip a switch on his back, which turns on his EX mode, causing him to change shape into a more humanoid, effeminate-looking robot, with eyeshadow, a glossy hairstyle, long stretchy arms, and slender legs in high-heeled boots. While the initial reveal is indeed surprising, the actual jokes don't land anywhere near as well because they're all more or less some variant of, "Look how hot my legs are," or "Look how exciting this show we're putting on is." And the sad thing is, it would have worked so much better with one simple change. Just having Mettaton's wheel turn into a pair of legs. That would have been so much more visually humorous. In fact, he straight up does that in the credits. I mean, Mettaton EX's design is certainly not a bad one, and it's appropriately flamboyant as could be expected from an inventor who watches anime religiously, but as far as humor goes, this was one of the few moments where I felt the game had missed a tremendous opportunity to be funny. Not only that, but it ended up scrapping a joke that the game had been running with quite well up to that point. He does get some additional backstory, however, which does a bit to flesh out his character. In order to enter his old house, you have to pay Bratty and Catty 600 gold for the key, and then when you finally get to his house and read his diary entries, you learn that Mettaton is in fact not a robot with a soul as he's been advertised, but rather he's a robot body for a ghost related to Napstablook. Alphys met this ghost, whom Papyrus refers to as Hapstablook, when attending his human fan club meeting, and proposed the idea to Hapstablook, which would eventually lead to Alphys being appointed the royal scientist. while Hapstablook would inevitably leave Napstablook behind in pursuit of fame. Once he begins his final battle with you, he reveals that he plans to use your soul to cross the barrier, leaving the rest of monster kind behind until, potentially, another human falls down, which, okay, first off, dick move. Second off, I honestly find it hard to believe that none of his audience had a problem with that plan. I mean, he televised the event and everything. Maybe he's just so beautiful he can make everyone forgive or forget the dickish things he does, like Boa Hancock or something, I don't know. But it takes Napstablook calling Mettaton once the battle is over for him to realize that what he's doing is stupid and selfish, and that's it. Yes, he goes through an arc just like the other characters, but it's probably the least satisfying out of all of them. In fact, Mettaton's backstory and development almost feel like more of an accessory to Alphys' character development than anything. Maybe I'm being a tad unfair to Mettaton because he's still plenty entertaining when he's on screen, but he's probably the weakest main character in the cast. He had such a good introduction and continued to one-up himself until that switch was flipped, at which point he sort of fell apart. He barely does anything in the genocide run either. He just shows off another new form, Mettaton Neo, then summarily eats shit and dies. Not even in a very humorous way either. I get the sense that Toby really struggled to keep Mettaton funny after his transformation because there's such a stark contrast between the writing styles of those two halves. Mettaton was funny in the first place because he was just a metal box, and yet he was still treated like an uber-attractive A-list celebrity by the populace, so turning him into an actually attractive A-list celebrity kind of ruins the joke. But hey, at the very least, he can still put on one hell of a show, and it was fun while it lasted. Now, Asgore is a bit of a strange case, because while the characterization he gets is really good, I also wish there was more of it. He's first mentioned by Toriel, implied to be a savage beast who lusts for your soul, but over the course of the game, other characters give wildly different accounts of what he's actually like, from Papyrus calling him a big fuzzy pushover, to Undyne reminiscing on her time training under him, to various other NPCs picking on him for his inability to name things. All these clashing descriptions are likely to completely scramble your mental image of what Asgore would probably be like, to the point that when you actually reach him, he'll either be nothing like you expected, or everything like you expected. When you finally do reach him, it's a rather awkward moment between the both of you, as both of you know you're about to fight, but while you probably don't want to do it, neither does he. He seems like such a gentle person in spite of his large stature, and he even tends a garden as you enter his throne room. Furthermore, a series of items in his house back this idea up, such as the Santa Claus outfit in his dresser, or the pictures of him and his family. Furthermore, it seems as though the populace of the underground really look up to Asgore, and herald him as a great king, which further increases the conflict of whether or not fighting him is really something you want to do. That conflict is further compounded when you actually beat him, and he reveals that he never truly wanted to conquer the surface world or destroy the humans, but he had to keep up the facade for all the denizens of his kingdom, simply because the hope that they could take back the world that was stolen from them was the only thing that most of the monsters really had to hold on to. An NPC very early on in the game says as much. As long as we got that hope, we can grit our teeth and face the same struggles day after day. So while it may be seen as a poor decision on his part to pretend to fight for a cause he doesn't really believe in, this nonetheless shows that at the end of the day, the well-being of his people is still very important to him, and his insincere promise of freedom would be better than certain doom. However, most important to him is his family, which had fallen apart long ago, as described to us mere minutes earlier by the monsters themselves. Through circumstances he could not control, he lost his children, and in a blind rage turned his emotions back toward the humans, setting in motion a plan to conquer the surface as revenge. His wife Toriel instead chose to abdicate the throne in response and ran off to the ruins, refusing to support Asgore in his conquest and leaving him alone to fester in his sorrow, collecting the souls of children and drawing ever closer to the day that he could finally set his people free. Caught for years between his responsibility as a ruler and his own moral code, he would fall into despair in the years to come. However, as Toriel points out in the pacifist ending, Asgore's plan had a huge hole, and that it only takes a being with one human and one monster soul to pass through the barrier. So he could have left when he got one and collected the remaining 6 on the other side. This is played up as a joke in the moment, but this supposed oversight to me reads as more intentional than anything. After all, he did admit that he didn't want power, so his most favorite course of action was to put off his conquest until it became unavoidable, i.e. once he'd collected a 7th human soul. Thus, by waiting until then, he'd be able to give his people a peaceful reintroduction to the humans instead of a violent one. As a side note, I just want to say that I really appreciate that Asgore is not merely a sympathetic villain, but a genuinely gentle and caring person whom, due to circumstances, happens to be opposed to you. The only other places I've seen something like this are in the films of Hayao Miyazaki, in particular, Lady Eboshi from Princess Mononoke. It could have been so easy to have him sit in his throne room and monologue at you about how your time has come and the monsters shall go free and all that schmutz. but still drop the emotional revelation once you beat him, like so much other media seems to think automatically makes interesting antagonists. But you can't just attach a tragic backstory to a boring character and automatically have that garner sympathy from the audience. So it's to Toby's credit that he tossed that tired concept out. Not to say that it can't be done well, but in Asgore's case in particular, it would have soured his characterization heavily. But back on the subject of Asgore, the only real problem I have with him is that he shows up very late in the game, so his room for development is significantly less than the other characters. We don't even get to see much of what he's like outside of his internal struggles, though what we do see is still thoroughly likable. For what it's worth, he does get a little more development in his short appearance in Deltarune, but considering it doesn't yet fit into Undertale's canon, I can't exactly apply that to this. Nonetheless, I hope he has more time to develop in Deltarune because he definitely is showing signs of starting an interesting story of his own. Hopefully, for some people, he'll have more significance than a certain other character. So, I won't lie, I actually really like Sans. I know he's been plastered all over the internet to the point that most people are probably sick of him, and often that also comes with horrible fan interpretations of him or just cursed things everywhere, Jesus, but I promise, if you were never sold on him, just hear me out. The first time we meet Sans is immediately after leaving Toriel behind. Initially, he comes off as a rather lazy but fun-loving skeleton, frequently shirking the responsibilities that Papyrus places on him in favor of literally doing nothing, occasionally making terrible skeleton puns and sometimes being facetious for no reason other than he finds it entertaining. Also, he has teleportation powers. Cool. However, as we move towards Snowdin, he starts to reveal that even though he knows Papyrus is terribly overconfident, he's still very much supportive of him and his goals. He also supposedly runs multiple hot dog stands across the underground, implying that he has his hands fuller than we're led to believe. But he does seem to spend most of his time at these booths sleeping rather than selling, so that's more or less left a mystery. During the hangout with him at Grillby's, he does start to give hints that he's more knowledgeable than we may have given him credit for, but it isn't until we meet him at the NTT hotel near the end of the journey that we see another side to him. He begins the conversation in sort of a weird way, wherein he questions whether or not our quest to return home is really worth it. When I first had this conversation with him, I was getting attached enough to the monsters in the world to think that, yeah, maybe living with the monsters wouldn't be so bad, but I think this is actually meant to suggest that Sans knows there will be more dramatic consequences for fighting Asgore and leaving the underground, but perhaps he just doesn't have the heart to tell the player. He also reveals that he befriended Toriel by talking to her through the door to the ruins, and at one point, she made him promise that if he ever came across a human, he would protect them. Had she said nothing to him, Sans claims, "You'd be dead where you stand." I know this is kind of old hat now that a few years have passed, but when this game first came out and this side of Sans was revealed for the first time, it raised so many questions among players that still had yet to be answered. Even when you meet him in the Judgment Hall at the end of a neutral or pacifist route, he talks in such a way that makes it seem like he knows much more about the nature of the world than most. After all, he is knowledgeable about the nature of execution points and the level of violence. Should you fulfill the requirements for getting the key to the back door of his house, he seems quite nonplussed at the fact that you have the ability to relive timelines over and over again, and he can tell just by reading your face too. While this only continues to raise more questions, some of them do indeed get answered during the final battle with him in the Genocide run. When fighting against him, Sans is still incredibly vague about what he knows, even with the revelation that he understands the principles of timelines stopping and starting, and that the player is the cause of it. Despite that, he's completely unable to actually retain memories between resets, instead relying solely on his ability to read the player's facial expression to determine what they've already been through and or how many times he's killed the player. However, he also reveals that his laid-back attitude is a result of apathy over the likely outcome that the player will just continue to reset, and even getting to the surface isn't worth holding out hope for so long as the resets continue to happen. This provides some closure on his motivations for stopping you, but even when you reach the end of the Genocide route or look through the papers in the back room of his house, so many questions about him are left unanswered. Why is he the only monster who bleeds upon being cut as opposed to turning into dust? Who are the people in the photo in the drawer? What is his badge for? What is the machine doing in that room? How much can he read from people? Would he be able to tell that Flowey was Asriel if he ever saw him? How did he learn that the world of Undertale exists within a video game-like reality with branching timelines? All of this is unclear, and theorizing over that is a bit outside the scope of this video, but nonetheless, this moment more or less signifies what makes Sans more than just some dumb asshole who makes puns all the time. He acts as though nothing really matters because he knows that in the end, nothing likely will, and so he seems to hide the existential dread behind a veil of shallow jokes, to come off as though he doesn't really know as much as he does. His attitude is also rather interesting in contrast with Papyrus, because where Papyrus' character arc is all about self-actualization, Sans sees no point in achieving self-actualization because he knows that there will be no future for him after reaching the surface. It's really easy for people to look at Sans and see him as merely the meme skeleton, or super depressed, mysterious, and or edgy, if not both at the same time, and I do sort of think a lot of fan interpretations of Sans paint him as something he really isn't. He's not an angsty hero for the monsters, nor is he so blatantly distrustful of the player that he would outright doubt their ability to do the right thing. Even in the fight against him, after you've done so many unthinkable things, he still tries to appeal to the decent human being within you. He's just a lazy guy who happened to learn the most horrible truth that his world has to offer, and thus gained a sort of aloof attitude towards everything, not even bothering to step in and stop the player from murdering everyone until he was literally the only monster left who could stop them. One could argue that this is a severe character flaw because he didn't stop the player from killing Papyrus despite holding Papyrus in such high regard, but here's the thing. If he knows that killing the player is just going to send them back to a save point mere yards away, what point would there be in stopping them? The best case scenario would just be Sans, Papyrus, and the player getting caught in a time loop where Sans just keeps killing the player over and over. At worst, both Sans and Papyrus would be killed at once. Sounds like a rather hopeless situation to be in to me. But either way, it's easy to see why Sans caught on with so many people, because he has the most unique characterization out of any of the characters in UnderTale. He doesn't have an arc, but rather his personality and motivations are given to you in small pieces over the course of the game, before the full picture on who he is finally put together by the end of the game. Yet, it seems as though that picture is a piece of a larger puzzle itself that we will never simply be able to put together because the information surrounding it is just too vague. Nonetheless, I would still consider Sans to be a well fleshed out character just going by what the game gives us. However, as much as I like him, there are still other characters who top him on my ranking. Alphys is, quite possibly, one of the most important characters in the overarching narrative of UnderTale, even though she doesn't seem that way upon her introduction. We first meet her upon arriving in Hotland, where she appears to be incredibly socially awkward and nervous to finally meet us. Nonetheless, she also becomes the first monster since Toriel to actually try and help us get home, instead of attempting to capture or kill us, and even upgrades our cell phone so we can access the previously seen 4th dimensional item boxes remotely, and she even signs us up for the Underground's main social media network, which was extra nice of her. Upon leaving her lab, however, she immediately hits us with an onslaught of social media status updates, all of which have varying levels of relevance to the current situation. Sometimes she's talking about working up the courage to talk to you at all, other times she's ranting about how much she hates the sequel series to Mew Mew Kissy Cutie. In addition, she attempts to help you with a lot of the puzzles strewn about Hotland, but usually screws you up in the process. In one of these instances, however, she straight up solves the puzzle for you, which, while humorous, also raises the question of why doesn't she just hack into Hotland's mainframe and shut the traps down herself? Now, these moments are likely where audience opinion splits on Alphys because, yes, her status updates are very frequent and sometimes annoying, but for me, they were annoying in an endearing kind of way. Even now, I know far too many people who just post ad nauseum on Twitter about the same things every day, or things which don't have anything to do with anything. Plus, Alphys proved herself to be very funny in these moments, so it was hard to get mad at her, at least for me. And a part of that is her humorous facial expressions, of which she has a great wealth, second only to Flowey. However, going back to the question of why she didn't just shut down all of Hotland's traps if she has access to the power supplies, Mettaton very clearly puts the idea in the player's head that she put you in danger so you would trust her to guide you through it. This much is also evident just from the way she talks when you disregard her advice, and she even admits after the opera scene that she suffers from self-esteem issues. Again, while some may look at this behavior and see Alphys as manipulative or conniving, it seems very clear to me that she does genuinely care about your well-being and sees you as more than just a tool to raise her self-confidence. Thus, it is easy to sympathize with her. However, even after you leave to fight the final boss of the neutral run, Alphys' characterization doesn't stop. Leaving the core after reloading the game triggers one final task in which you must deliver a letter from Undyne to Alphys and then go on a date with her. And it was on this date that it finally clicked with me that Alphys is canonically bisexual. In retrospect, it was probably something I should have noticed sooner, but for the longest time I'd never been exposed to media that treated homosexuality as completely normal or just a fact of life. So yeah, as embarrassing as it is to admit, this game was my first experience with proper dignified LGBT representation in a piece of media, and I have to commend the game for not making Alphys' bisexuality her only defining trait. Plus, her attraction to Undyne is just adorable anyway. But it's through this date that she finally comes clean to Undyne about a great deal of things she'd lied to her about in order to impress her, and being the strong-willed fish warrior she is, rather than get mad over the fact that Alphys lied to her about a bunch of stuff that doesn't matter, she instead seeks to correct the problem that led to her lying streak, with the help of Papyrus, of course. Furthermore, this simple act of kindness from the person she admires most inspires her to come clean about a secret she'd been holding on to from everyone, a far darker secret at that. After having become the royal scientist by demonstrating Mettaton to Asgore, he tasked her with finding a way to break the barrier using soul power, After all, she had told everyone that Mettaton was a robot with a soul, but in actuality, he was just a robot body for a ghost. So Alphys did not by any means create a soul or anything which could even output the same type of power. She could extract it from other monsters, but monster souls vanish instantly upon death, and extracting soul power from living monsters would kill them. Thus, she set about a new course of action, to make monster souls persist after death, in the way that human souls do. Thus, she extracted the power of determination from the human souls, with the plans to inject it into the souls of monsters who were already on the brink of death, then to put those souls into a vessel which would be used to break the barrier. As it turns out, that vessel would be a flower blooming from Asgore's garden, on which the dust of his son, Asriel, had spread several years prior. And according to a book in the library, a monster's essence will live on in whatever object its dust is spread upon. So Alphys, unknowingly, injected that flower with determination along with the dying bodies of the monsters, and while initially none of them showed signs of life, the dying monsters would soon wake up and begin roaming around as if nothing happened, while the flower, returned to Asgore's garden after Alphys deemed it a failure, became Flowey, who retained all of Asriel's memories but because he lacked a soul, could not feel compassion or love. While Alphys was inadvertently responsible for Flowey's creation, which would of course nearly lead to disaster later down the line, a more immediate disaster was looming. As mentioned previously, monster bodies have significantly less physical matter than humans, so they are unable to contain the power of determination for long periods of time, and eventually, all of the resurrected monsters began to melt and fuse together, becoming horrifying monstrosities known as the Amalgamates. Alphys, realizing what she had done, shut herself off from the outside world, refusing to answer any of the letters sent by the families of the now amalgamated monsters. This horrible mishap caused her to develop severe anxiety issues and threw her into a deep depression. A conversation with Undyne alludes to the possibility that she may have attempted to commit suicide by throwing herself over the edge of waterfall, but Undyne meeting her just barely managed to prevent her from going through with it. But of course, eventually she would realize that keeping the Amalgamates secret from everyone wasn't going to help, so she went back into her true lab to round them all up and bring them home. Thankfully for her, the residents, while put off by the monstrosities, were nonetheless willing to accept them back into their families with open arms, and forgive Alphys because, after all, the whole thing was just an accident, and they were all used to horrible tragedies by this point. Of course, she doesn't go completely without consequences because she's fired on the spot once Toriel finds out. Not that she cares, because she has loads of anime to watch with her new fish waifu. Yay! Out of every character in this game, Alphys, in my opinion, has the strongest arc out of all of them. Yes, all of the characters with the exception of Sans learn new things about themselves and the way in which they used to be wrong, but Alphys becomes a noticeably different person by the end, and in such an uplifting way, too. Once at the brink of suicide due to things she could not control or predict, she conquered her fears, not by lying to others and keeping her dark secrets locked away, but by being honest in both what she's done and who she is. I know that for some people, it's hard to get past the fact that she handled it so poorly in the first place and faced, let's be real, extremely light consequences for her actions. But here's the thing. What matters about her arc is not that she is appropriately punished for what she did, but that she had the courage to face the consequences in the first place. In that way, her story could even be inspiring. How many times have any of us been in this situation where we were too afraid to go through with something, or come clean about a misdeed because we were worried what the consequences might be? Often, said consequences aren't nearly as bad as we imagine they are, and even if it hurts, we'll be better people coming out the other end. Of course, there's always a possibility that I'm just biased because, Alphys is just freaking adorkable. The way she gushes about anime is hilarious. She can be really confident when she wants to be. She cares so much about being helpful to you. She looks so soft and huggable. Her smile is just too sweet. Her dress is really cute, and I just realized I'm simping for a fictional lizard weeb. Oh hey, remember when I mentioned Asriel and Flowey earlier? Good, because now I'm talking about them. Flowey is the first other character you see upon entering the Underground, and while he initially puts on a friendly facade, acting as a sort of tutorial character for the game's combat system, he quickly reveals that he's actually malicious as f*** and nearly kills you outright before Toriel comes in to save you. After that, you don't see him again until you get past Toriel, wherein he suggests that sooner or later you'll end up giving into your supposed true nature and killing a monster out of a desire to do so or simply frustration from not being able to spare them. If you spared Toriel, you'd probably be unlikely to take shit from him, but a fair number of players when the game came out actually couldn't figure out how to spare Toriel, and if you kill her, Flowey remembers. And while other characters remark on moments repeating between save files as if it were deja vu, Flowey remembers every gory detail of previous timelines. For much of the rest of the game, he doesn't appear at all, but he can occasionally be seen popping out at the edge of the screen, watching from a distance as you continue on your journey. He only reappears once you defeat Asgore, killing him and taking the 6 human souls he'd already collected, and with their power, he crashes the game. Upon reloading, you find the game to be corrupted, as the intro cinematic changes drastically and glitches out. You load into a black void, and the only save point that exists is actually a trap, wherein Flowey destroys your save file, effectively taking control of the game away from you, with the exception of moving. Not that it will do you any good against the onslaught of bizarre projectiles Flowey's new form launches at you, nor will it give you much of an advantage against Flowey taking control of your saving and loading functions, using it to disorient you and cause you to get hit by attacks that you may have previously dodged already. After all, Flowey now has the power of 6 souls, whereas you only have 1. But over the course of the fight, you do slowly win them back over to your side and once again assume control over the game. Finally, you have the choice to fight or spare Flowey. And while it may be tempting to fight him and shut him up for good, there remain questions left to be answered about him. And if you kill him, you may never get those answers. Plus, after all the times he taunted you, saying you can never resist killing someone if you really felt like it, why would you want to prove him right? At this moment where he's completely at your mercy, resisting violence when it seems most tempting is something that Flowey just can't grasp. But why then did he expect you to be such a bloodthirsty monster from the start? Where on earth did he get that impression? The answers lie in the pacifist and genocide routes. As previously stated, the True Labs journal entries shed light on Flowey's origins and how he came to be in the first place, but they also house a series of videotapes filmed mostly by Asriel Dreamer, the son of Toriel and Asgore. In these tapes, we catch glimpses of his relationship with the first human to fall into the underground, named after what you entered at the start of the game. For the sake of simplicity, I'll simply refer to this human as Kara from now on. While the tapes don't shed much light on their own, recalling back to the story the monsters told you as you made your way up to Asgore's throne room, some pieces start to fall into place. In the story, Asriel met Kara after they fell down into the underground, and after bringing them back to the castle, Kara became Asriel's adopted sibling. It's widely known that after some time passed, Kara fell ill and eventually died, but the tapes reveal that Kara's illness was actually planned. In a baking accident, Kara discovered that the buttercup flowers that grew in Asgore's garden are poisonous, so they concocted a plan for Kara to eat the buttercup flowers, die, and have Asriel absorb Kara's soul in order to cross the barrier and collect the remaining 6 souls from humans on the surface. However, when the humans saw Asriel carrying Kara's dead body and assumed that he'd killed them, they reacted violently, beating Asriel to the point of near death, but he didn't fight back. Despite Kara's soul giving him immense power, as Asriel later points out, he and Kara had split control over his body, and he made the decision to not fight back, against Kara's wishes. Despite his injuries, he still carried Kara's body back to the castle, collapsing over Asgore's garden and dissolving into dust. Of course, that dust would transfer Asriel's essence into a flower, which would then be injected with determination by Alphys, thus giving it the will to live. Asriel's regret over not fighting back would eventually manifest as Flowey's kill or be killed mentality, but he didn't immediately wake up believing in this. As Flowey explains in the genocide route, when he first woke up, he was almost exactly like his old self, personality-wise, but he discovered within a very short time that he no longer felt love for either of his parents, or compassion for anyone. Without the ability to feel love, he attempted suicide, but due to the determination injected into him, he would always respawn back in the same place and time he first woke up in, but still with all the memories of the previous run. Realizing all the ways in which he could use this power, he first attempted to use it to befriend people, but without compassion, there was no real enjoyment on his part. As a result, the more he talked with people, the more he began to get bored of them. Reliving singular moments over and over again, figuring out people's personality via sheer trial and error over potentially hundreds of iterations, made him realize that people are too predictable when you can only ever see them this way. Thus, he became curious to see what would happen if he killed someone, and while his initial reaction was negative, the more he did it, he began to feel a sense of catharsis in it. But he admits that by the time the game began, even killing people was becoming tiring, and instead decides to destroy everything with Kara, succumbing fully to his destructive nihilism. When I got to this part of the game, I was deeply moved by the poignancy of Flowey's backstory. It occurred to me that Flowey must have resetted hundreds or even thousands of times, with each run lasting a varying amount of time, meaning that if you stack up all of his runs on a linear timeline, he may have been Flowey for dozens, possibly hundreds of years. Just the idea of that slow descent into madness over such a long period of time really made me feel uncomfortable to think about, and despite us never seeing his transition for ourselves, it's described in greater detail than most examples of immortal characters I've seen in fiction. As a result, almost nothing of Asriel remains in Flowey's personality. Granted, none of the time frames for his runs are ever specified, but that I think is to this game's benefit. It forces the audience to use their imagination, and extrapolate between the points in the given information, forcing you to imagine what it would be like if you couldn't die, forced to relive the same moments in time over and over and over again. You might recall me pointing out how I'm not particularly fond of sympathetic villains, but that's only because they're most often done poorly, and Flowey is a fantastic exception. Just as an example, Kureo Mado from Tokyo Ghoul is revealed to have been fighting against the ghouls so mercilessly because one of them killed his wife, but this revelation falls flat for the simple reason that we never actually know what his wife was like. She's not actually a character, just a prop to get a cheap jolt of sympathy from the audience. On the flip side, we would already know Toriel and Asgore very well by the time we hear this monologue, so we have personal connections with the characters whom Flowey's revealed to be related to. And learning that their tender love and care was stripped away from him at such a young age, replaced with nigh eternal emptiness and a descent into madness, is utterly heartbreaking. Of course, the powers of determination also play into the meta-narrative, with Flowey's experiences somewhat mirroring those of real-world game completionists, who want to see every single line of dialogue, every item, every interaction, but after enough time doing that, you'll reach a point where there simply isn't any more material to dig into, and eventually, after enough replaying the game over and over, you won't find it fun anymore. The difference is that Flowey exists within the same world as the game. He doesn't have the luxury of just playing a different game because he can't leave the one he's a part of. Kara's company is so desirable to him because Kara was the only person he can never predict, since Kara is a stand-in for the player, meaning that every possible iteration of Kara that exists in this world will go through the game in a slightly different way. In addition, they have determination powers that supersede Flowey's. After all, this is a one-player game, and if determination grants you control over save points, then it can only be granted to one person, so Flowey is now able to die, but he's long stopped wishing for that. Now all he wants is to keep you playing with him forever. And if he can't have that, then he'll just destroy the whole timeline. Of course, with the revelation that you're the only one that can save the game now, he decides to use it to his advantage, by attempting to kill you over and over again, preventing you from finishing the game. Being weaker than you, however, he needs the power of the human souls to be able to beat you, and since 6 already proved ineffective, he hatches another plan. Once the player enters the true lab, Flowey organizes a plan to distract everyone while he takes the human souls, by rounding up all of the supporting cast into one room together and ambushing them after gaining the power of the 6 souls. Then, once all the other monsters from all over the underground show up to help, Flowey uses this opportunity to absorb the souls of every monster in the underground. After all, putting all of their souls together would equal the power of one human soul, thereby giving him the power of all 7. And with that power, Asriel Dreamer finally returns to his true... Oh no. Now in this new form granted by all the souls' power, he decides to use it to reset the entire timeline from the beginning, thus never allowing the player to reach the end, while also knowing that the player's motivation for a happy ending will continue to push them to fight against Asriel over and over and over again. However, that motivation also ends up giving the player the ability to refuse death, continuing the fight like nothing happened when they die. I've seen a lot of people argue that this significantly diminishes the stake of the narrative, considering this basically makes it impossible to lose. However, considering the emotional height this climax has come to, I would say it earns a pass. I was able to fully buy into the situation without breaking my suspension of disbelief, and the soul refusing was a brilliantly uplifting sight. Even with this ability, however, Asriel's transformation into his Angel of Death form grants him such power that he can lessen the player's determination with every death, while also erasing the memories of the monsters whom they'd come to know over the course of the game. As the player loses the ability to save the game any longer or even move, they instead call out to the lost souls of their friends, inside of Asriel, restoring their memories. One of those lost souls is Asriel's own, and as the player calls out to him, memories of his past life, so long ago, come flooding back. He remembers that Kara was not simply a tool for his own enjoyment, but his best friend. In this moment, he realizes his selfishness and loses his will to fight, before reverting back to his original form. Finally able to think straight again, Asriel apologizes for all that he did as Flowey, admitting he was wrong, before finally putting the souls to good use. He finally fulfills his role as the vessel for the human and monster souls, channeling their energy into the barrier to destroy it for good. However, because he needs to return the souls to their rightful owners, he'll soon lose the ability to maintain his old form and feel compassion, turning back into a soulless flower. Before he leaves, you have the option to comfort him, and it's difficult not to, considering that he was goaded into a plan that would end in his death, and at such a young age as well. Even in spite of the awful things he did as Flowey, his suffering was undeserved. He needs comfort. I've heard some people argue that Asriel's hard to get attached to because he is introduced so late into the game, and for much of the rest of the game, he's only talked about by others. But still, even with what little time he does have, in my opinion, he has a very defined personality. A naive child who means well but doesn't realize the consequences of his actions and is a little gutless, which is actually a very believable child. By all means, this is exactly the kind of child I was, so it's hard not to relate with him a little bit. But also, Asriel's personality does not simply exist in a vacuum. While Flowey's personality is so drastically different from Asriel's, understanding the bridge between the two, in addition to the impact Asriel's death had on the characters we already have relationships, is crucial to garnering sympathy for him. In conclusion, despite the very unorthodox character path, Asriel/Flowey manages to be the most well-realized character out of all of them, having direct ties to the narrative and meta-narrative themes of UnderTale, being an interesting character at every phase, going through a massively cathartic arc, and being responsible for some of the game's most heart-wrenching and horrifying moments. On paper, none of it sounds like it would work, but the end result was among the most compelling of stories I've ever experienced. But even then, he's not my favorite character. Now, I feel a little weird talking about this one because despite her being my favorite character, it's in spite of some pretty glaring character flaws. I've seen a fair amount of people who actually hate her. She's hugely overbearing, downright patronizing on some occasions, almost unreasonably harsh on Asgore, and some would argue that she's a terrible parent as well. I have my own takes on most of these claims, and there are some I cannot completely disagree with. But at the end of the day, I have my reasons for liking her, some more subjective than others, but let's start with the objective ones. Firstly, Toriel's role as a tutorial character was created as a direct parody of other hand-holdy tutorial characters like Fi from Skyward Sword. As a result, she will often solve puzzles for you, label the correct switches to flip, or literally hold your hand through one puzzle in particular. And if you know gamers, they do not like tutorials, especially for something as easy to understand as this game. However, even though I too found the tutorial section to drag on a little long, and there are definitely some parts that do not hold up on repeat playthroughs, I still really enjoyed reading Toriel's dialogue and seeing her reactions to whatever bizarre crap happened. In spite of carrying herself in such a formal manner, she can sometimes be really funny and also very endearing. When you arrive at her house later, she almost immediately makes sure you're okay and offers to heal you if you sustained any damage. Upon bringing you inside, she shows you your room, bakes you a pie, plans a curriculum for your education, and thinks of fun activities for you and her to do together. You can even enter her room and read her diary filled with terrible puns, which is not only adorable on its own, but foreshadows her friendship with Sans, which we will learn about later. This also further sets her apart from previous examples of mother characters in video games, whom most of the time are not actually characters, just placeholders or stereotypes, who serve next to no purpose for the player, if any. Granted, for a first-time player, they'll obviously look at all this planning and find it very creepy, especially with her petting the player's head, but knowing what I know about her now, this whole environment says a lot about Toriel that we don't get clued in on until later. However, the game cannot continue if we simply stay at her house, and unfortunately, she doesn't actually do anything besides sit in her chair and read a book, so you have to ask for the exit. Upon hearing this, she decides that she needs to destroy the exit to prevent you from leaving, as she believes you'll surely perish against the monsters outside the ruins. The only way past her is to fight her, and while she doesn't respond to sparing initially, Frogget NPC in the ruins says, "Sometimes you'll have to spare someone even if their name isn't yellow." Some might argue that attempting to measure a child's fighting capability by fighting them is a very irresponsible thing to do, and yes, in the real world it is, but this is obviously not the real world. However, what's important to note is that Toriel will avoid attacking the player if their health gets too low, and only by a really bad stroke of luck or extreme suicidal tendencies can she actually kill you. But also, if she didn't really believe you would be able to survive outside, she wouldn't give you the option to fight her. There is some part of her that has faith in your ability to take care of yourself, and as you fight, she slowly starts to realize that she really is wrong to keep you trapped in the ruins with her, despite her promises to take good care of you. With enough perseverance, Toriel can be spared, and as she says goodbye, she gives you one final motherly embrace before letting you go and returning to the house, alone again. She doesn't reappear for most of the game, but she is mentioned by Sans during your conversation with him at the MTT Hotel, wherein he recounts the pun battles he and Toriel would partake in every so often, as well as the promise he once made to Toriel that he would look after any humans that fell underground. She's also mentioned by Asgore after you defeat him, where he describes that after Azrael and Kara's death, he declared war on the humans, but Toriel abdicated the throne out of disgust for Asgore's actions and went into hiding in the ruins. in an attempt to intercept and shelter any further humans that fell down. She also took Kara's body with her so as not to let Asgore use their soul to harm any humans, and gave it a proper burial beneath the flowers you start the game on. Now, a lot of people like to pinpoint this story as the main reason Toriel is a bad person. Most assume that Toriel immediately left Asgore without attempting to talk him out of his declaration, but to me at least, she doesn't seem like the kind of person to do something like that so hastily. Obviously, this gets into headcanon territory, but I believe Toriel tried as hard as she could to get Asgore to reconsider, but he either would not budge or told her to leave if she would not support his cause, and eventually she just couldn't take it anymore. Maybe I'm being an apologist, but that would make sense to me. Later, Toriel comes back in the true pacifist ending, having realized that she could not let you fight Asgore all by yourself, or allow you to bear the burden of freedom coming at the cost of Asgore's life. While this may sound like she went back on the arc that she went through at the beginning of the game, where she learned to let you survive on your own, what this reads as to me is instead her realizing that anyone losing their life is unacceptable, whether they're a human or a monster. Yet, a lot of people like to point out that a severe flaw of hers is that she never admits she was wrong for leaving Asgore, all because she held the moral high ground over him, and to be honest, if you hate her for that reason, I really won't be able to change your mind, because it all depends on where your own values lie. Most of the people who told me they hate Toriel are generally of the mindset that Asgore had every right to get revenge on the humans, and Toriel's peacekeeping method was useless at best. But the way I see it, both parties were equally responsible for the suffering they both endured after Asriel's death, both wrong in their own ways. They were in a great deal of conflict with one another, and had Toriel stayed, things probably could have only gotten worse between them. While it seemed to Asgore at the time like humans were only capable of violence, which is perfectly understandable given the circumstances, Toriel knew that humans were just as capable of compassion and sympathy as monsters, and she was absolutely right to think that. But also, even if she was wrong, real-world couples have broken up over less than this, and it's not always the case that both parties are completely right about their respective stances. So if you ask me, by no means was Toriel being that unreasonable with Asgore, but considering the circumstances, an altruistic viewpoint would ultimately accomplish nothing if she wouldn't take action, so she left. As the recent Winter Alarm Clock dialogues on the official UnderTale website describe, Toriel apparently spent much of her time in the ruins in a state of almost total disrepair, failing to eat or sleep properly at times, which, when you think about it, losing 2 children and subsequently 6 more humans before you arrived must have been extremely hard on her. This also goes a long way to explain her overprotective nature. Losing so many children due to factors outside her control would have drastically impacted her self-esteem and caused her to think that if she can't protect you from the outside world, then she must be a terrible parent, and the torment that she went through likely would have made her even more bitter towards Asgore. Though, while this whole thread is from outside the game's actual content, it was a possibility I had already put together just through inference. With all that said, Toriel has more or less completed her arc at this point, and even if it ended on a somewhat bittersweet note, it is thankfully mitigated by just how hilarious her antics with Sans are. Some might see these jokes as kind of lame, considering how well-worn the trope of old person not understanding technology is, but the sheer joy she displays in experiencing it for the first time in years is too precious to be disappointed in. Finally, once everyone else runs off to explore the surface world, and it's just you and Toriel alone again, you have the option to stay with her, or go back to wherever you came from. Unlike at the beginning of the game, however, if you decide not to stay, Toriel will completely respect your decision, not even trying to get you to reconsider. But of course, considering how kindly she treats you and how well she would probably take care of you, it's hard to refuse her in the end. However, none of this characterization is what puts her at the top of my ranking. Honestly, I would still say that Alphys and Asriel are better written characters than Toriel, but this is where that subjectivity comes in, and if you'll permit me, I need to bare my soul a little for this. I first played this game shortly before my own mother died, and it was only after she passed away that I realized just how much of her life she gave to me and my sister. She was probably the best mother I could ever ask for, and I didn't really realize what I had until it was gone. So, somewhat emotionally vulnerable at the time, I turned to Toriel because, in a way, she also dedicates herself fully to motherhood and exudes a strong desire to protect and care for children in need of a parent's love. And when I saw this, I realized how much of that same desire my mother had, and how little I truly appreciated it. This might sound pathetic for me to admit, or possibly even disrespectful, but for the longest time, even now, I look at Toriel as if she were my own mother, and the warmth she makes me feel is the closest thing I now have to genuine motherly affection. In spite of the mistakes she's made, I believe she can still be an amazing mother. In spite of the fact that she's a fictional character, she's one that I wish were real, and that I could meet. In fact, that goes for all of the characters. They're all so charming, varied, and likable that I wish I could be friends with them in real life. And that distinction, I think, is what sets them apart from other RPG casts. Yes, they may have likable characters too, but the thing about them is they may be interesting on their journey, yes, but who's to say they'll continue to be interesting in their daily lives? Just because one character saved another's life doesn't mean that character will be good in casual conversation. Yes, I know, those games have far different goals for their characters, but in Undertale, because we get to see these characters living their daily lives, they end up feeling so much more real and relatable than any other RPG cast I've ever seen. I can imagine myself in a room with all of these characters and having interesting conversations with them, whereas if you put me in a room with the cast of Earthbound or Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasy VI, I would have no idea what we'd be able to talk about outside of events that happen in their respective games. For my money, all of these characteristics combined make Undertale's supporting cast some of my favorite video game characters ever, in spite of how simple they seem on the surface. The camaraderie they share with one another is so wholesome that I just can't help but wish I could be a part of it. And for 10 to 15 hours, I felt like I really was. Even now, after having spoken about this game for over 20,000 words, there's still so much to say about it. I didn't even touch on all of the extra details, like how certain items bought or found early in the game can be used in later boss fights to give you advantages, or the sheer number of variations of the neutral ending depending on who you kill and who you spare, or even all the new content added to the PS4, Vita, and Switch ports of the game. There are so many small touches in every nook and cranny of this game that bring the whole experience to life. These are the kinds of touches that can only come from a place of true passion. The kinds of touches that make this game feel like more than just a game, and instead like a real, breathing world. Any and all problems I have with this game are heavily eclipsed by everything I enjoy about it, and in many cases, its few sore spots are more than made up for by its strengths. This might sound stupid of me to say, but if it were mathematically possible, I would rate this game 11 out of 10. I really did enjoy it that much. In fact, not only did I enjoy the game itself that much, but my feelings were further compounded by the lasting impact this game had on me. Yet, for the longest time, I felt so insecure about enjoying it. Soon after I got into it, I would continually hear people compare Undertale unfavorably both to games that inspired it and similar mother-inspired indie games like Lisa the Painful. Undertale's influences are more than obvious to anyone who is intimately familiar with video game history. The defense system was taken from the Mario and Luigi series, the bullet hell segments were inspired by Toho, the dialogue system was inspired by Shin Megami Tensei, the subversive nature was heavily inspired by Moon, and of course, the game's quirky world and characters were heavily inspired by games like Cave Story, Earthbound, and Mother 3. I've known people to look at Undertale and claim it's just a ripoff of these other games, and while most of the time those people are just contrarian, some of the people saying this were among my closest friends, and I thought they had legitimate points at the time. I began to hear this so often no matter where I went that I was starting to feel like I was misplacing my praise, that other games which did what Undertale did first deserve my attention more. But that simply isn't the case. Undertale doesn't simply copy mechanics from those old games, it recontextualizes and expands upon them, while blending all of those disparate elements into a cohesive whole. From gameplay to story to characters to messages, these pieces all march in lockstep to create an experience that I have never had with another game. They intertwine with one another in such a way that cutting any one of them out could drastically weaken the game's overall impact. That is not something I can say for any other game, where you could feasibly remove or alter certain aspects and get a somewhat similar experience. Even if you make the argument that everything Undertale took from those other games was done better in previous incarnations, that really wouldn't matter. Because firstly, Undertale was not made with the intent to compete with any of those games, and secondly, there's no arguing against someone's personal taste, so if you think Undertale is just X game but worse, you're still allowed to think that, obviously, but you'd better not police the tastes of others. Of course, even with all the naysayers around me, I felt so inspired by this game's rich world and characters that I felt such a strong urge to make fan art of it almost all the time. I would draw characters and moments from this game almost religiously in the pages of my notebooks at school, and over time, as I improved my drawing skills, I decided to try animation as well. In March of 2016, I attempted to make an animated review of this game with a friend of mine who brought up a lot of the potential criticisms I mentioned throughout this video. Unfortunately, the amount of work we would both need to do, combined with mounting creative differences, led to us scrapping it. I still have some remnants of it on my channel, but certainly nothing substantial. However, in the process, I met a great number of people while scouting for voice actors who I'm still friends with to this day. In between all of that, I would continue to make fan art and find so many other amazing artists who were part of this fandom with me. Fats Geronimo, TC96, Absolute Dreams, Zoragi, Assorted Jellies, Lynx Griffin, and Monster Candy, and so many more. Lots of these artists have fallen out of the fandom since I first discovered them, but they're still making great art nonetheless. And of course, all of their pages will be linked in the description. Many of them also have their own alternate universe stories, and yes, people love to point at the ones that are either derivative of one another, sloppily put together, or just way too focused on just Sans and no one else. But there are many AUs out there with just as much love and care put into them as the original game. One of the most famous is Dreamer Reborn, a story wherein Frisk gives their soul to Asriel so he can live a normal life again. It is a beautiful and touching story in and of itself that further develops Asriel and Frisk as characters, as well as their relationships with other monsters while still staying true to the themes and characters of the original game. That last point in particular is very difficult to pull off, and while it's not a terrible idea if an AU author wants to take it in a completely different tonal direction from the source material, it's hard to really make it feel like Undertale if you deviate too much. The people that can pull that off successfully are immensely talented people. I'm not one of those people, to be honest. Knowing how many people are representing this game well already and hugging up all the original ideas, I've never bothered making an AU or telling very many stories based on the game of my own. But with animation gradually becoming easier and easier for me over the last few years, I sought to make my mark on the 3rd anniversary, and even though I had to make compromises to get it out roughly around the time it was supposed to come out, I'm still quite proud of it. However, it was a later Undertale animation I made that managed to catch the attention of Strelok, a sound designer and producer who has worked on many high-profile Undertale animations, most notably Glitchtale. Because he found my Sans vs. Frisk animation, I got to be a part of an ongoing Undertale parody series called Interlopers, alongside so many of the talented artists I used to merely be a fan of. I never could have imagined that one day I could call myself equal to them, and I am unfathomably grateful to Strelok, TC, and Dream for welcoming me on board. But most importantly, it was because of this game that I met the love of my life. I met him on Tumblr as we simply shared art of the characters back and forth and started a really nice friendship. Though he was going through a bad breakup at the time, I tried to do my best to comfort him and patch up his relationship with his ex. And through this whole process, I realized I felt so fulfilled looking after him, and he was so unbelievably kind to me whenever we would talk. Heck, I didn't even know I was bi until last year when I realized the feelings I had for him. Now we've been dating for over a year, and despite the occasional rough patch, I couldn't be happier with him. And to think, we met because of some little indie game made by a guy who started off in Andrew Hussey's basement. It's crazy to think of where we'd both be by now if Undertale never existed, or even if it wasn't popular. But I don't trouble myself with such thoughts, because the fact of the matter is, I'm happy with my boyfriend, and I always will be. And Luke, sweetie, if you managed to watch this far, I love you, and you truly are the best thing that ever happened to me. But on the subject of me without Undertale, where will I be if I must leave it behind? This game has done so much for me that a part of me just wants to hold on to it forever and never let go. But then again, don't I have anything better to do? Well, yes, many things. Many new things to do, new things to see, new things to learn, new things to experience. And I shouldn't let my attachment to this game hold me back. I will never stop loving this game for all that it did. But I'm sure that 5 years of me rambling about it and mentioning it will have gotten old to most of the people who know me by now, and even I can't only draw Undertale for the rest of my life. So with this video, I hope to close the book on this game for a good long while, until the next time in my life where I pick it up again for old time's sake. With my statements made, my love proclaimed, my appreciation expressed, I'm finally secure. Of course, I will still grace it with more art every now and then, or even make animations about it every so often, but really, I've let this game rule my life a little bit. It's time I really took this game's message to heart and moved on to greener pastures. But don't think for a second I'm joining the rest of the naysayers proclaiming Undertale is dead. On the contrary, it will live forever in the hearts of the people who played it, watched it, read it, heard it, and loved it. As long as all of us stay determined